Welcome to the H Academy. Our speakers are author Max Borders and philosopher and economist Max Moore.
Let me start off by making two assumptions. The first assumption is that economics is part social science and part ideology. The second assumption is that most economic activity today is shaped by a mixture of three forces: technology, culture, and governance. In the past, economics has mostly been about trying to find the one true way. For example, what kind of economic system optimizes for social welfare? At the very least, economic policy tends to be monolithic, with the rules being set by state authorities. In the future, there will be more opportunities for economic pluralism. In other words, people will be able to experiment with different economic systems no matter where they live. I believe we ought to move towards a condition of greater economic pluralism. Despite entrenched legacy systems, the rapid evolution of technology, culture, and governance will shape the future of economics. With decentralization, we will move into a meta system that looks more like a free market in governance services. And that, by the way, is a very different thing from claiming that any given system should be a free market. Why? Decentralization means people will be able to join an economic system as they might an intentional community or a civil association, and the systems will compete. Competition among providers of governance services offers three distinct benefits. First, it humbly acknowledges that there's no one true way. People have different subjective preferences about the economic systems they want to flow in. Second, it acknowledges that the consent of the governed ought actually to mean something. And third, it acknowledges that people can join economic niches according to their particular conceptions of the good. The radical shift will be that governance services, including economic systems, are systems entrepreneurs will provide instead of being systems that authorities impose. In this way, you can think of economic pluralism as a kind of meta-doctrine, but not a doctrine per se. It is a commitment to experimentation and choice, so the only doctrinal aspect really is the consent requirement. In any case, people will try different systems. Not all systems will succeed, but that's okay. The threat of exit means evolutionary forces test each system. With economic pluralism, we will have to be far more active in determining what systems of association comport with our ideas of the good, but that's actually a good thing. And by lowering the costs of exit, we'll be able to live in the system we truly prefer, whether communist, capitalist, or something in between. The big trade-off is that we will no longer be able to impose one true way on everyone. That's the gist. Thank you.
In thinking beyond the current economics and the way economics is being developed, to think about what is the possibility for the future? How can things actually radically change in the future? Let's not get stuck in today's mindset where when we ask what's possible, what usually people mean is how can we get the Republicans or Democrats to support some tiny little modification? We're actually not doing that. In Max's book, Collapse, which I strongly recommend, it's beautifully written and full of wisdom, what you'll see is something much more radical on the premise that, there we go, there's the cover. You should go and buy that, it's an excellent book. On the premise that we're really pushing the limits here and things are falling apart, and hopefully, might sound odd to say, hopefully there'll be a big collapse, but a productive collapse, kind of like in a dissipative structure, you can collapse into a higher order, and that's what we're hoping for. And as Max Borders says, what we're hoping for in the future really is competition in governance. We're not just talking about competition in economics here, but competition in governments. And people find that very confusing. How can you have, sure, you have to have a central authority, one person in control over a particular geographical area. And in fact, that's something which I think both Maxes here are going to challenge. So that's pretty much it, other than to say that for even several decades ago now, I, along with various friends and colleagues, started thinking about some crazy ideas that obviously couldn't possibly come true, like these digital currencies. Like 25, 30 years ago, like digital currencies and encryption and that kind of stuff, that's obviously nuts, right? So that's never going to happen. So we do have a little bit of street cred in the sense that we actually did foresee things that other people didn't.
When you're talking about someone's baggage when they use a word, I think capitalism, which is a coin, if I'm not mistaken, was not coined by capitalists at all, and either by Marxists or by Marx himself. And nevertheless, there are some Marxist critiques of capitalism, indeed critiques of capitalism, that come from both sides of the proverbial aisle or across the political spectrum, or Nolan chart, whatever you like. The important thing to realize is to press someone on what they mean by capitalism when they say they don't like it. So, for example, when I point to an economic system that has a central banking regime that controls the money supply, and and there is no free banking, no competitive currencies, no way to escape that monetary regime, is that capitalism? There is, this phenomenon that Ronald Coase identified within the firm, which is that given certain transaction costs, it would make sense to form a corporation of a certain hierarchical structure, and given transaction costs of a certain level, that it would be impossible to maintain a market-like firm. Well, the transaction costs are changing due to technology. So what do we mean? Do we mean the capitalist firm that people don't like because they don't like the boss, they don't like the wages, and so on? So we really have to unpack what is meant when people say capitalism, because I don't think it's altogether straightforward. And a lot of times it's just it's someone's feelings about matters rather than the particular circumstances in which some capitalist is operating, namely some entrepreneur, and those constraints, those institutional constraints on his or her behavior as the entrepreneur. Likewise, the customer, the monetary regime in which it operates, and the institutional constraints for, say, mediation in terms of conflict. So there's a whole set of institutional questions, which you might call institutional economics, around what it means to be capitalist or a capitalist system. And I think if you are able to get alignment on those definitions, and you really begin to talk to people about matters like voluntary association, or the benefits of exchange, the need to be productive, the possibility of creating different kinds of firms that are perhaps more egalitarian or fair in the sense of proportionality, that some of the problems with capitalism dissolve. Not all. I think there's a lot of the sort of Paleolithic envy instinct when people talk about capitalism. But at the end of the day, I think there's a lot of features of capitalism that people wouldn't throw out with the bathwater.
Yeah, actually, I think that's quite right. We said about the origin of the term. I don't think Karl Marx himself actually coined the term, but he popularized it. And so the question really arises, well, if an enemy of the system, a self-declared enemy of the system, is the one who either created or popularized the term, should we be using it at all? Of course, you can also reclaim terms, just as in the gay community, the term queer was reclaimed, for instance. Something that was considered offensive now became something that was considered okay and inclusive. So I don't know, I'm of two minds whether to use the word capitalism. Of course, Milton Friedman used it in Capitalism and Freedom. So should we reuse it? Well, one problem with the term to me is it's not literally wrong, but capitalism, what does that mean? It seems to emphasize capital, the accumulation of capital. It makes people think of, big 19th century business people with big top hats, counting their money, accumulating capital. And that's not really the core of what it's about at all. So I'd rather use the term probably free market, because as Max said, capitalism can be all kinds of things. It can be state capitalism. It can be something where you actually have private property, or private ownership of the means of production, but a massive amount of intervention. And on the extreme scale, you have fascism and related systems where there's not really that much different from socialism, in which the means of production are owned by the government, supposedly the people, but the government. They both result in central control. So you may own it, but someone else is telling you what you can do with it. So what the good part of capitalism, free market capitalism, which is very different than what we have in the United States or any other country pretty much right now, is really a system of voluntary exchange. It's where I offer you something and you have something that I want, and we agree on that exchange, or we don't. And we both benefit, because otherwise we wouldn't make the exchange. Now that's to oversimplify it, because you have to ask about the institutional systems behind that. What are the laws? What are the property rights? And that's not a simple thing. You have obviously questions about intellectual property. Is that something you should better own? Patents, are they okay? Does that work? Is the current patent system good? Well, almost certainly not, and needs to be revised. So there's a lot of complex questions, but I think the fundamental distinction is between market capitalism or free market economics, where people are free to engage in activities or not, and this more centralized form of state capitalism, which is what we have right now. We have what usually called a mixed economy, an economy in which most things are privately owned, but there's a massive amount of government intervention and spending and taxation, and an enormous number of rules. If you want to create a new business, you have to go to all these different agencies. And in some countries, it's almost impossible to start a business. It can take you 10 years. So I think what we're talking about is rescuing market capitalism, or just the free market. There are other terms like catalaxy, but nobody's going to adopt those. So I guess we can probably forget about those. So really, it's about understanding voluntary exchange and the price system, how the price system, which people still, if they haven't actually read, the right books, they don't understand the price system. They don't understand how amazing it is that all these millions of people around the world, without ever knowing one another or talking to one another, can somehow magically coordinate. Adam Smith called it the invisible hand, kind of unfortunately, because that makes it like a central agency again, just an invisible one. But they somehow coordinate to produce things that you can buy extremely cheaply. And that's something that's not sufficiently appreciated. I recommend going and looking for, I'm not sure exactly what it's called, but it's The Story of the Pencil, or The Fable of the Pencil. I think it was by Leonard Reed. It's a short piece, but it is a rather beautiful illustration. Just take a simple object like a pencil, which you probably are given free or buy for a few cents. And he describes, you never really think about a pencil, right? It's just a boring little object. But if you actually delve into it, you find that the rubber comes from one country, the strip of metal comes from another, wood comes from else, graphite from another place. Actually has a lot of complexity to it, all these different parts that have to come together, lots and lots of people coordinating their actions over a whole planet, and somehow you get this pencil costing you almost nothing. And you think, wow, that's amazing. What kind of incredibly powerful and smart central controller put all that? Well, none. There was none. It was the market that did it. And that's because of the price system, which, as Hayek said, is really a knowledge system. It's a means of expressing your preferences and coordinating them to produce amazing results. And I like to stress really the parallel between economics or market economics and evolution, in a sense, in that good economics is evolutionary. It's not one of these top-down models. It's a matter of letting people build up solutions from the bottom up by communicating through the price system.
Metaphorically, there is, I believe, and I detail this in After Collapse, there is a kind of a machine metaphor that still holds sway from the past century. It's the idea that there's this sort of linearity, this causal physical understanding of the economy that can be limbed or described or otherwise given, that economists, even the brightest economists, simply don't have access to. The brightest and best economists of all time realized the humility with which one must address a complex adaptive system like an economy, and realize that no model or metaphor is going to be able to accurately capture it. I do, however, say in the book that I appreciate the economy as ecosystem, or society, socioeconomy as ecosystem metaphor is much more preferable, because obviously the Great Barrier Reef is a highly complex adaptive system. And that is a far preferable to thinking of the economy as being like a 747, where you can just go in and or even mission control. Like, there are these economists sitting in Washington that are going to adjust the rheostats and the dials and put money in the appropriate places to get some sort of pro-social result. And this is simply bad thinking. And
well, my comment is, yeah. To elaborate a little bit, yeah, I think that it's the economy as a machine metaphor is a really damaging metaphor. I think one person did a good job in tackling that, and I'm not sure if the book is still in print, is Michael Rothschild in his book Bionomics, in which he explicitly makes the parallel between economies and ecosystems and evolutionary systems. And that's the way to think of it, because if you have a machine that works on kind of relatively simple principles and is understandable from a top level system, you're going to try and pull, turn dials and pull levers and prime the pump and all these other metaphors that economists like to use. Whereas really we should be thinking of the economy more like a garden or a forest, maybe like a garden that you have to tend very carefully, and you make small adjustments in the rules, basically. So it leads to a very different approach. Instead of trying to find what you think are smart people who can shape the outcome, instead what you need to do really is figure out what are the simple rules we can put in place, and that includes things I was kind of alluding to is to intellectual property rights and how you define property rights. What are the basic rules you put in place? The simplest rules possible. And this is kind of the paradox is the more complex the economy, the simpler the rules you need. I think it's quite possible in a very small group, certainly in a family, you don't need a market economy. If you know 3 or 4 people in the household, you don't need a market economy. You might still use some market kind of mechanisms. Maybe in a kibbutz up to maybe 100, 150 people, you might not need one, although they seem to be getting less popular. But when you have more and more people, the only way you can coordinate that really is through a market or a price system. And you have to throw out the machine model because that's just, we need an ecological model instead. So I really completely agree on that point.
You know, that's a really complex question, and I want to parse a couple of things in the question. The first being that I think that most of humanity, strictly speaking, has a lot of compassion for the least advantaged in societies, and for that matter around the world. Not even our neighbors, our neighbors and people in our family are the easiest to see and easiest to appreciate, because the development of kinship ties and community ties is much easier when it's local. But also, you know, in an era where we can get a window into the rest of the world so easily through technologies like this, it's also possible to see that there is suffering in different places, or at least relative poverty. That being said, I think the impetus in this 20th century urge has been, we must ban poverty. And we do that by dint of creating these large welfare states. The welfare states happen to be impersonal, and money is dispensed, or largesse is dispensed in rather algorithmic fashion according to your need or whatever. The problem with this general model of a centralized welfare state is not that it was based on bad intentions. It is that it was based on the mistaken notion that incentives don't matter, and they're not perverse incentives, and that you're not destroying something in the process. I think around the turn of the 20th century, 1 in 3 Americans, I believe, but certainly also in the Anglophone countries, was a member of a mutual aid society. And mutual aid societies were where communities wove the social safety net with one another much more closely. And that intimacy and that relative contribution of people who could look after each other, but also in some sense critique each other for bad habits, whether it's drinking or, shirking your responsibilities or whatever, that these communitarian ties could really help bolster how you could help people that centralization completely did away with. So I think it's strange, but the greatest critique of capitalism in the United States today is the welfare state, because it gave people this sense, and I'm speaking about my own country, but also other countries I think can say this too, is this sense of outsourcing your responsibility to distant capitals makes you more selfish, because, oh, I'm paying my taxes, somebody's paying for that. We no longer have this sense of mutual aid and ties to our communities, and therefore we're simply not as compassionate a people. And so what is left is just consumerism in a lot of ways.
There's a real lack of historical knowledge. It's partly because economics and history are taught mostly by socialists and Marxists these days. There's a complete lack of knowledge of mutual aid in the past and how these voluntary systems worked. And there's actually a rich literature out there, which I encourage people to read. And remember that these systems, for the most part, I mean, they still exist today in to various degrees, but for the most part, we look at the past when people were a lot poorer, and yet there was still a huge amount of mutual aid. And indeed, as Max said, people actually are helpful. The amount of charity is enormous. A lot of it may be channeled through organizations that maybe aren't using it that well, but people are generous. I think one thing I do want to tackle before we talk about UBI and other such bad ideas is that there's so much talk about inequality all the time, and now iniquity is the latest term, which I think is kind of an appalling term that tries to smuggle in some moralistic ideas. I think that you're going to be very suspicious about this term inequality, because I think it builds in as a presumption that everybody should be equal in outcome. And in fact, if in an open system, a free exchange, what we really want, again, I talk about basic rules. One of those basic rules is people are equal in rights. They're not equal in terms of guaranteed outcomes. In fact, those two are incompatible, because if people are free to do as they choose and to trade and to create or not create as they choose, there won't be equal outcomes, even if they start off equally. The only way you get equal outcomes is through coercion and compulsion. So there's nothing especially good about equality. I think the underlying issue when people say equality, hopefully the real issue for them is that they're concerned about the people down at the bottom. They want to raise them up. And that's perfectly fair. And I think a good open system can do that more effectively. And one thing we have to realize is you can't just look at a snapshot of things as they are at any moment in time and say, oh my goodness, there are people with trillions of dollars and or at least hundreds of billions and people with almost nothing. You have to ask, well, how are things changing over time? And how can we accelerate the move of people at the bottom? And in fact, if you look at the literature on this, and there's great resources, go to humanprogress.org, for instance, and just look at this stuff. What you'll find is the number of people living in extreme poverty has been shrinking and shrinking over a very long period of time. And in fact, that has accelerated in recent decades. So if you clamp down on that, if you shut down the structures that are making people's lives better, you're not doing any favors for the people at the bottom. Now, that said, I think there are a lot of interventions, a lot of centralized interventions that are keeping people poor. And I think Max kind of hinted at some of those in terms of the welfare systems. We've created a huge amount of dependency. Johnson's war on poverty actually was a war in favor of poverty. It really blocked a lot of progress in that area. So there are a lot of voluntary options for helping people out in a responsible way where, instead of this completely blind system where you're sending checks to people you don't know and in all kinds of different circumstances, and some of them don't need them and some of them are just going to sit on their butts. Instead, in a system where you actually know these people and you have some responsibility for them, I think that could be a lot more effective. So it's not a matter of do we help bad people, poor people or not. It's a matter of how do you help them, or how do you help them to help themselves and take care of those who actually can't help themselves. So I think one thing we have to do is get rid of this idea that quality is something that is inherently good, and instead ask how can we help the poorest to be better off. And just as a final comment on that, I'm saying that inequality, to use that awful term, differences is a better term, differences in income and wealth is an inevitability. If you try to suppress that, you're just going to cause all kinds of problems. And I know that Max makes this point in his book, because I read it recently, and I totally agree with this point, that the distribution of outcomes follows something like a power law. And this is something you can see in nature as well, and in many, many other examples. It's a pretty hard iron law to break. So really, instead of trying to suppress that, again, open things up and help people work their way up that pyramid. And people who are at the bottom at one time can move up that scale. And that's still true today. People say, oh, that's no longer true in America. It actually is true. It could be even more true if we got rid of a lot of the barriers to progress for those people. Or should we discuss UBI? Natasha mentioned that. It's such a popular idea.
It is a popular idea. And I have to say, as recently as 2006, I interviewed, I was working at the time at this publication is now defunct called Tech Central Station. I was the managing editor there, and it was I was able to interview Charles Murray at the time, who had written a book on something like a UBI or something similar to a basic income scheme. And as a kind of pragmatic, as an ideal, it's idealist and it's pragmatic in two senses. It's idealist in the sense that you're never going to be able to implement it exactly as you want to in your ideal way, which would be a complete replacement of the welfare state as we know it. So you get rid of all three of the tsunami of red ink entitlement systems that are threatening to completely drown the country in a tsunami of red ink, which it's happening right now. These transfer schemes are just massive. Now, I can also pick on the Department of Defense for its spending profligacy, but the big three entitlements are massive. If you were to replace those with some sort of basic income scheme, that could be a pragmatic compromise of sorts, and it would probably be better than what we have now. And yet, I don't think that that's ever going to happen. And I think that sadly, the UBI is going to be in addition to other systems that are already threatening to throw the federal government into some sort of sovereign debt crisis. But there are just so many things about the UBI that I personally find problematic. And I guess, the main one being this idea of mutual aid, of having sort of local knowledge and communitarian ties with people in order to be able to assess whether something is or isn't a good means of being charitable or helpful or benevolent. You know, all of those communitarian ties with the UBI, it just sort of means you know, you sort of just get some money. And I think that can create a lot of, you know, uh, human house cats. I worry about the human house cat problem, and I also think it can give people opportunities to do creative things and those, you know, be more generative behavior. But I think that's probably a small subset. We've seen the effects of welfare, and UBI is no different in this regard, I'm afraid.
Of course, there was a version of this, and people are sometimes surprised to hear this, that the ultra market economist Milton Friedman suggested something like this before UBI became a term, and he called it the negative income tax. But it was a pretty similar idea. It wasn't exactly the same. The basic idea there was that you set a certain income level, and above that you pay taxes, and below that you receive money from people who are paying taxes without any particular condition. So it was kind of similar to the UBI with its lack of conditions. But I totally agree with Max that the problem is in the real world, yeah, you can say, okay, we'll abolish all these other systems, replace it with the UBI, but show me how that's going to happen. Show me how many other government programs you managed to get rid of before you try and institute this enormous, incredibly expensive one. It's not going to happen. It's going to be added on to other systems. Why? Because there have all kinds of special interest groups who flourish through these other systems. You've got all the bureaucrats and all the recipients and the politicians who want to buy votes, just as Gavin Newsom is doing right now by throwing more money at people into an economy that's overheating, and yet where people are being subsidized not to work. So it's really not a very good system. But to think ahead a little bit, you know, there's been a lot of discussion. Natasha mentions artificial intelligence, and people are discussing this idea of a developing economy in which, at least in this scenario, there will be fewer and fewer jobs. Now, I'm not convinced this will actually happen. It would have to be a radical break from the way things have always been, in which, yes, jobs have been displaced by mechanization and automation, but in the end, we've actually had more jobs. Otherwise, nobody would have a job today, because obviously there are far more people than there were in the past. But it's possible maybe AI could get so good and robotics could get so good that you really don't need many of the jobs at all, and somehow not enough new jobs come up. Let's just say that that's going to happen, which I'm not totally convinced about. So do we want a UBI? Well, if we're going to do something like that, here's what I think is a better alternative, one that encourages personal responsibility and doesn't require a centralized authority. That basically is invest in the AI corporations, buy shares. I mean, right now, we don't, share ownership is way too low in this country. I don't know what it is in most other countries, but I'm sure it's pretty low. Most people don't spend much time even paying attention to that. They often get things in their 401k or their IRA. That may buy them some shares. But if you encourage people to actually own shares in these AI-driven corporations that were making, you know, lots of money, they would have an income stream from that. I think that would have some of the same potential issues as UBI in that you might be subsidized to just sit on your butt all day. But if you have to sit on your butt all day because there really aren't any jobs, hopefully you won't be sitting on your butt. You'll be out there learning how to write a novel, or you'll be sitting down with Max and me to think about how to design new societies, maybe out in space, or doing something useful and productive like that. So I think that would at least have that advantage.
That's a great question. And really, it goes back to this idea of nicheification. So I started off talking about, and you know, this is one of really the through lines of After Collapse, is this transition from these chosen states of affairs to away from rather the imposed governance systems. And with the imposed governance systems, we have a sort of a regulatory regime that we hope that won't get captured by crony capitalists. We hope that the laws that are meant to help the environment won't get caught in amber, like, you know, 1971 Clean Air Act has done, and instead has much more flexibility with respect to how things actually well, there's a really great forces at play when it comes to the economy, broadly speaking, and that is ephemeralization or substitution effects. So what we're seeing now is that we're capable of doing more and more with less. So in terms of externalities, and I want to use externalities as an example of what we're talking about here, when we have these enclaves who are doing different things and trying different kinds of social experiments, whether they be economic or social, there's going to be these spillover effects that we call externalities. And if you have a regime that emerges like that has this economic pluralism, you're going to have a coevolutionary set of entities that are there for dispute resolution. Okay, I do truly believe that the idea that it becomes too costly to go to war with another system or another country or another jurisdiction over time, and we the actors in that kind of regime will want to minimize those costs. So that means we're going to see the emergence of these kind of arbitration or mediation regimes that will minimize the conflict that may be coming out of externalities or imposing costs onto other systems. But that is absolutely a good question, and you know, it's no different in many respects in what's happening today. We see the oceans filled with trash from Southeast Asia and China, for example.
It is a good question, and it's something that people don't understand very well about markets. Markets do have to have rules behind them, and externalities are a problem when you don't define the rules properly, when you have common ownership, where the ownership actually needs to be assigned to individuals. Something that's been known as the tragedy of the commons by Garrett Hardin. If you have, say, a big field or a forest or whatever, any large resource that's commonly owned, nobody really benefits by improving the land, because if say 1,000 people use it, you get 1,000th of the benefit. It's not really worth it. Whereas you can take from it as much as you like, and that leads to the tragedy of the commons. So we want to try and minimize that. And Max mentioned the oceans. One area in which we tend to have a problem is with fish. And we have fish farms which are privately owned, and they do just fine, and no problems with them. But when you have a common ownership, that's a problem. But that can change over time too. That's not necessarily a fixed condition. We find that as technology improves, it affects transaction costs. It affects what you can track and trace and how you can assign responsibility. If you have satellites up there that can say, actually look at the movement of smoke across continents and countries, or even see into the ocean and see where schools of fish are going, you might be able to establish property rights in those. And once you've done that, people then have an incentive to maintain those. You don't want to destroy your resource. So I think another important thing that Max mentioned is ephemeralization. I want to just emphasize, draw a line under that one. There's a book out by Andrew McAfee, which is very good at stating his current views on that, which I've been reading his stuff for probably about 20 years. Ephemeralization, also I think Buckminster Fuller maybe mentioned that quite a long time ago. The idea really is that to produce economic goods and services, you don't have to have a fixed amount of stuff. Over time, we actually can and actually have reduced the amount of stuff per dollar of GDP. So for instance, the automobiles we drive today are very different from those in the 1950s, which had huge amounts of steel and other materials. Today, they're a lot lighter, a lot less stuff involved. Entertainment involves basically putting out your tablet or turning on your TV rather than building movie theaters and big stadiums. People are more and more really ephemeralizing their entertainment and their information systems. So we can actually use a lot less material. And if you look at the charts, again, go to humanprogress.org or one of those similar databases, and you'll find that we can do more with less. And that's something that can happen. And that can reduce the externalities as well. But those externalities do vary over time. And this related issue of how do we help the worst off, because they can sometimes suffer from the externalities. Well, over time, there is a well-known phenomenon among development economics that early on in people's development, when they're poor, they just need to survive. They need to take care of their basic needs. So in rich countries like ours, we can lecture poor countries on, oh, you're not taking care of your air quality, your water, you're burning coal or wood, actually, probably more likely. But they need to do that to survive. It's only by actually allowing their economies to develop quickly, they'll reach a point, I think it's around 4,000 US dollars a year, that you reach what sometimes called in the Kuznets curve, basically the idea that at a certain point, you start valuing different things. You start valuing having cleaner air and a better environment, and you start paying for that. And so what you see is a deterioration in conditions for a while, and then at a certain point, that starts reversing and things start getting better. So yeah, I'll leave it at that.
Thank you, Max Borders, and thank you, Max Moore. I look forward to seeing you in the breakout rooms, and we'll pick up from there. So Max Borders, your closing statement, then Max Moore, and then I'll close out.
I think that we have the opportunity in the future of economics and economic systems, and indeed social systems, to begin to weave ourselves together in different forms of shared reality that, of course, have to make some sort of, that will have to have contact with the real world. So it's not just about solidarity of ideas in which we spin our wheels and have low cost opinions. we have to get to a state of affairs where reality checks us and we check each other. But in so doing, we start to weave together in decentralized fashion, but in our unity. So e pluribus unum and ex uno plurus, from the many one, from the one many. I hope that in presenting all of these ideas about economic pluralism, that while we talk about some standard economic thinking that is really pointing to a bright future, that we also never lose our desire to have local, small experimentation. And that experimentation leaves us humble in thinking that maybe we don't know the one true way, but we do not want to throw basic economic concepts out with the bathwater. So what I appreciate about Max Moore's contribution today is really unpacking some of those things that neo-Malthusian thinking or neo-Marxist thinking is trying to throw away in an effort to indulge some instincts that we might call communitarian or even compassion, whether that's for others or for the planet. In that way, I'll leave you and hope that obviously that you'll pick up the book, and I'm happy to answer any questions from anyone. Please reach out to me. I'm happy to share my contact information with you. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you, Max. And just to sort of, I guess my final point is getting away from all these details of the specifics of economics as it is today. If you read Max's book, or you read some of the things I've written in the past, the core concept here is something that Robert Nozick called a framework for utopia. I'm not really keen on utopia, or they call it extropia, because that's not a static system. It's something where you're continually evolving. But the basic idea is we're not trying to impose one value system on anybody else. We're having kind of I think Max calls it integral liberalism. We're trying to produce a framework within which people can experiment with all kinds of different political and economic rules and ways of living. So we're trying to give a meta framework, essentially. And that's something that's very difficult to do on this planet right now, because it's pretty much locked down by centralized authorities. Now, hopefully it will collapse in a nice way, as Max suggests is likely. If that doesn't happen, that's one reason to pursue life extension and maybe cryonics as your backup plan to live long enough. So I think there's at least long run reason for optimism to get out of these systems that we're stuck in right now that have centralized control. Thank you.
I am now going to open the breakout rooms we have scheduled. Room 1 is on changing economics. Room 2 is on future economics. And room 3 is on Viridian economics. If you have not yet made your selection, please type 1, 2, or 3 in the chat, and I will assign you accordingly. I'm opening the rooms now.
That was an interesting point. I don't know what the commonality is other than economics gives you a very different way of looking at things. It teaches you to think on the margin rather than thinking about all of this or all of that. It asks you to think of a little bit more of that. It's a very different way of thinking, and I think it's a skill that I wish more people would develop. It's really a form of critical thinking in a way, and of looking at side effects and third order effects and the things we don't normally see. As long as you look at the right kind of economics, not all just these mathematical models that assume that you actually have omniscience. That kind of economic thinking maybe not so helpful.
I was noticing some of the debates in the chat, or not debates, but friendly conversation in the chat about the nature of regulation. And, is it possible to have decentralized forms of regulation? Max Moore was referring to the common law, which is something that I think is an important regulatory mechanism that can be absolutely expanded if you don't have this statutory regime sort of snuffing it out. This sort of deliberative process about where we bring all these ideas to the table, sometimes those ideas, whether they're abstractions or whether they're done by people who are brilliant, it tends to be divorced from local knowledge. This persists even to this day, even in the age of artificial intelligence and supercomputing. We still have this perspectival problem with respect to not only knowledge but skin in the game. And the extent to which you can have more decentralized systems is the extent to which you can have greater local knowledge and more skin in the game, and even more community eyes on what you're doing and saying. And this process, I think, can be seen in the common law with more jurisdictions, where the common law can change. It changes with the times. You know, there is precedent in the common law, but it does really build in much more of this local knowledge, and it also builds in the advance of technological and innovative means to really regard those specifics of time and place, whereas statute law tends to be done, placed in amber. Despite the deliberative process of so many smart people, it tends to be a monolith or megalith structure that never goes away, even as everything changes around it.
Maybe I could just add briefly a quick point on that. Something that didn't come up, which I'm kind of surprised neither of us brought up in our session, Max, is that I think there's an important role that's somewhat recognized today, but not sufficiently still, in decision markets. There's all, sometimes called prediction markets, various other terms. But what these do really is they allow people to use their local knowledge, their particular expertise, and it's basically a mechanism for combining that across any number of people, really, to produce a market that basically prices in people's beliefs about the future. And so rather than having one expert or even a small group of experts sitting around, advising the president or the CEO of your corporation or whoever, you have everybody putting their information in there. And having incentives, having, as you said, skin in the game, a very important thing that Nicholas Nassim Taleb also talks about quite a bit. So it really tends to produce amazingly good results compared to the best experts who just don't do as well. You see that in all kinds of examples, from forecasting the take of new movies at the Hollywood and the Hollywood Stock Exchange, to Hewlett-Packard forecasting how many cartridges are going to sell for their printers. The forecast markets do a lot better than their top experts. There's many examples of that. I think there's a lot more room for things like futures markets and decision markets.